She had no idea her janitor husband was the trillionaire owner of the mall she managed. But she divorced him to marry the district manager anyway, and what he did when he bought the store an hour later shocked her and made her beg for mercy. Rachel Morrison had spent 3 years dismissing Daniel Hayes as nothing more than the night shift janitor who scrubbed floors in the very mall she ran with an iron fist. But beneath his worn coveralls and calloused hands lay a secret so massive it would shatter her world in ways she never imagined. The divorce papers were still warm in her briefcase when she walked into her manager's office that fateful Tuesday morning, her engagement ring from district manager Blake Patterson gleaming on her finger, but she had no clue that the man she'd just destroyed was already making a single phone call that would transform her triumph into her worst nightmare. Daniel had stayed silent through every humiliation, every dismissive glance, every moment she'd paraded Blake in front of him, but the second she signed those papers, he activated a plan that had been waiting in the shadows, a plan that would reveal his true identity as the billionaire mastermind who actually owned every square foot of polished marble beneath her designer heels. What drove a man worth more than most countries to mop floors in his own empire while his wife climbed the corporate ladder without knowing she was climbing his ladder? Why would a trillionaire watch the woman he loved fall into the arms of a man who was nothing more than a middle management opportunist with a cheap suit and cheaper morals? And when Rachel discovered that the store Daniel bought an hour after their divorce wasn't just any store, but the flagship luxury boutique that represented everything she'd worked for, the crown jewel she'd promised Blake they'd control together, would she understand too late that mercy wasn't in the vocabulary of a man who'd given her every chance to see him for who he truly was? The story. The fluorescent lights of Grandview Mall hummed their eternal song at 11:47 p.m., but Rachel Morrison wasn't listening to their electric symphony as she clicked across the polished Italian marble in her Louboutins, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her body. She'd been the mall's general manager for 18 months, but every single day she walked these halls like she owned them, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield made of sales figures and occupancy rates that kept climbing under her watch. The numbers were her religion, the profit margins her prayers, but tonight she had something more important than quarterly reports filling her thoughts. She had Blake Patterson waiting in her office, the district manager whose corner office commanded 3 malls in the tri-state area, and the man who'd promised her a future that didn't include a husband who smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Daniel Hayes pushed his mop bucket past the fountain in the center court, his reflection fractured in the water that never stopped flowing, but he didn't look up when Rachel's heels announced her approach, like a judge's gavel striking wood. He'd perfected the art of invisibility over 3 years, becoming the ghost in coveralls that people saw but never noticed, the janitor who existed in the peripheral vision of success, stories that didn't include him. His hands, scarred from chemicals and calloused from labor he didn't need to perform, gripped the mop handle with the same steady pressure he used to grip boardroom tables in cities Rachel had never visited. But she didn't see the contradiction because she'd stopped seeing him 18 months before she'd stopped loving him. "Still here, Daniel?" Rachel's voice carried that particular frequency of contempt that wives reserve for husbands who've disappointed them in ways they can't quite articulate but can definitely weaponize. "I thought even you would have finished the food court by now, but I suppose mediocrity has its own schedule." Daniel didn't respond, but his jaw tightened in a way that would have warned someone who was paying attention, except Rachel had stopped paying attention somewhere between their 2nd anniversary and the moment Blake Patterson had complimented her on a merchandising strategy that Daniel had actually suggested over breakfast. The silence stretched like taffy between them, sweet and sticky and ultimately empty, but Rachel was already moving past him toward the executive elevator that would carry her up to decisions that would change everything. Blake Patterson had the kind of face that looked good in LinkedIn profile pictures and better in the dim lighting of hotel bars where ambition met opportunity and made arrangements that had nothing to do with love, but everything to do with leverage. He stood when Rachel entered. His suit probably cost what Daniel made in 3 months of mopping, but neither of them knew that Daniel's watch, the scratched Timex he wore over a wrist that had shaken hands with presidents and tech moguls, was just for show, a prop in a performance that was about to reach its final act. "Did he see you?" Blake asked, but his smirk said he didn't care either way, that Daniel was less than furniture, less than the potted plants that Daniel's night crew watered with precision and care. "Daniel," Rachel laughed, but the sound had edges sharp enough to cut. He barely looked up, but that's the thing about people who've accepted their station. They stop fighting gravity. What Rachel didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, because knowledge requires attention and attention requires respect, was that Daniel had looked up. He'd seen everything. The file folder in Blake's hand with the Henderson Luxury Boutique logo embossed in gold, the same boutique that Rachel had been obsessing over for 6 months. The anchor store that defined Grandview Mall's prestige and drove foot traffic that made every other store profitable. Blake had connections with Henderson's corporate office, or so he claimed, but Daniel knew better because Daniel's offshore holding company owned Henderson's corporate office, had owned it for 7 years, purchased it the same week he'd met Rachel at a charity gala where he'd been dressed in a tuxedo instead of coveralls, playing the role of venture capitalist instead of the custodial ghost he'd become. "I'm filing tomorrow," Rachel said, but her voice carried triumph instead of sorrow, victory instead of grief. "My lawyer says it'll be clean, no assets to divide since he has nothing, but I want it done before we make our move on the Henderson deal." Blake's eyes glittered with the particular greed of men who mistake access for power, but he pulled Rachel close in a gesture that would have broken Daniel's heart if his heart wasn't already reconstructing itself into something harder, something that understood justice better than it understood mercy. "Once you're free, we'll approach Henderson's together," Blake promised. But his promises were built on foundations he didn't own, couldn't own, would never own. "Your management record plus my corporate connections, they'll have to give us the master lease, and then we're not just running this mall, baby. We're running the whole damn region." Daniel had heard enough, but he'd been hearing enough for months, years maybe, ever since Rachel had started staying late at the office, not to work, but to dream with a man who sold her fantasies she thought Daniel could never provide. He pushed his bucket toward the service elevator, but his mind was already 3 moves ahead, already calling his attorney, the one Rachel didn't know about, the one whose firm occupied 4 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper and whose retainer cost more than this mall generated in a month. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday, but Thursdays had always been cruel to Daniel ever since the Thursday his father died and left him an empire built on commercial real estate and tech investments that most people couldn't comprehend. His mother had made him promise something on another Thursday, 3 years and 2 months ago, right before the cancer took her voice but not her clarity. Find someone who loves you for you, not for what you can give them, but test them first. Make sure they see your soul before they see your portfolio. So Daniel had tested Rachel, had stripped away every marker of wealth and worn the uniform of invisibility, had taken the night janitor position at his own mall under a subsidiary company name that couldn't be traced back to Hayes Global Holdings. He'd wanted to believe she'd see him, really see him, would notice the way he read The Economist during breaks, would question why a janitor spoke 3 languages and had opinions on international monetary policy. But Rachel had been too busy climbing to look down, too focused on her ascent to notice that the ladder she was climbing was built by the man she was leaving behind. "Sign here," the process server said, but Daniel had already read every word, had actually written some of them through his attorney, making sure Rachel got everything she thought she wanted: the apartment, the car, the freedom to marry Blake Patterson in a ceremony that would be lovely and empty and ultimately meaningless. Daniel signed with the same Mont Blanc pens he used to sign acquisition deals worth billions, but the process server didn't notice the discrepancy between the pen and the coveralls, didn't understand that some people collect contradictions the way others collect coins. The ink dried fast, faster than the 3 years he'd invested in a marriage that had taught him more about human nature than Harvard Business School ever could. But the education was complete now. The test was over, and Rachel had failed in ways she wouldn't understand until the lesson began. Rachel received her copies on a Friday, but Fridays were her favorite day because Fridays meant weekend plans with Blake, meant dinners at restaurants where Daniel could never afford to take her, meant a future that sparkled like the engagement ring Blake had already shown her in the kind of jewelry store where Daniel's holding company owned a controlling interest. She signed the papers in her office, her hand steady because guilt requires conscience and conscience requires the ability to see others as fully human. But Rachel had spent so long seeing Daniel as a failure that she'd forgotten he was a person. "It's done," she texted Blake, but the message carried celebration, not mourning, carried the excitement of a woman who thought she was trading up when really she was trading everything for nothing. Blake's response came with a champagne bottle emoji and an address: Henderson Luxury Boutique's flagship store, the crown jewel of Grandview Mall, the 15,000 square foot palace of designer goods, where perfume cost more per ounce than Daniel's supposed hourly wage. "Meet me here at 2 p.m., Blake's message continued, but his next words made Rachel's heart race with anticipation that would soon curdle into something darker. "My contact says the corporate office is finally ready to discuss new management, but we need to present a united front, power couple running the anchor store that runs the mall." What Blake's contact hadn't told him, what Blake's contact couldn't tell him because Blake's contact didn't know, was that Henderson Luxury Boutique wasn't just for sale. It was already sold, purchased that morning at 9:47 a.m. in a transaction that took exactly 11 minutes and involved wire transfers from accounts in 3 countries. The new owner had paid $23 million over market value just to ensure the sale closed fast, closed before Rachel could arrive for her 2 p.m. meeting, closed before Blake could pitch his vision of management synergy that would never materialize because the store now answered to someone who understood both retail and revenge. Daniel had made the call at 9:36 a.m., exactly 1 hour after Rachel's signature had dried on the divorce papers, but time had always been something he understood better than most people. His private attorney, James Wu, had handled the transaction with the same efficiency he brought to every Hayes Global Holdings acquisition, but this one was personal in ways that made James uncomfortable, made him ask questions that Daniel answered with silence, and a wire transfer authorization that made questions obsolete. "The store is yours," James confirmed, but his voice carried concern that Daniel didn't want to hear. "But Daniel, this is your ex-wife's mall, your own mall, and you're buying stores inside it? Why not just reveal yourself, take back control, fire her, and be done with it?" Daniel's response had been quiet, but quiet the way earthquakes are quiet right before they tear the world apart. Because mercy isn't the same as justice, but justice requires understanding, requires the full weight of consequence, and Rachel hasn't felt consequences yet. She's only felt success she thinks she earned. At 1:47 p.m., Rachel touched up her makeup in the mall's executive bathroom, but her reflection showed a woman who'd convinced herself that beauty plus ambition equaled destiny, that Blake Patterson was her ticket to a life where people noticed her for reasons that had nothing to do with a janitor husband who'd held her back. She practiced her smile, the one that said, professional but approachable, the one that had served her well in negotiations with vendors who didn't know she was preparing to become more than a mall manager, preparing to become a power player in retail management that spanned regions and commanded respect that Daniel could never give her. Blake met her outside Henderson Luxury Boutique at exactly 2 p.m., but his confidence had the hollow quality of men who've been promised things by other men who don't have the authority to deliver. He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that Rachel mistook for excitement. But nerves and excitement wear the same face until consequences arrive to clarify the difference. "Remember," Blake said, gripping Rachel's elbow in a possessive way that Daniel would never have tolerated, but Rachel found reassuring, "We're partners in this, your operational excellence plus my corporate relationships, but let me do most of the talking when it comes to the financial arrangements." They walked into Henderson Luxury Boutique like conquerors entering territory they had already claimed in their minds. But the universe has a way of teaching humility to people who've forgotten how to learn it naturally. The store gleamed with the particular brightness of luxury retail, where lighting is engineered to make everything look desirable and nothing look affordable, where sales associates wear better suits than most lawyers and speak in tones that suggest you're privileged just to be breathing their air. The store manager, Margaret Chen, no relation to any Marcus or Sarah, waited near the main counter, but her expression carried something Rachel couldn't quite identify. Something between pity and anticipation, like someone watching a car accident that hasn't happened yet, but is absolutely inevitable. Margaret was 62, had managed Henderson's for 17 years, and had received a phone call that morning that had confused her, intrigued her, but ultimately changed her entire afternoon schedule. "Ms. Morrison, Mr. Patterson," Margaret greeted them, but her formality had increased somehow, had shifted from the casual professionalism of equals to the careful distance of someone who knows secrets that create hierarchy. "Thank you for coming, but I'm afraid there's been a significant development." Blake's smile flickered, but he recovered with the practiced ease of men who've learned to fake confidence when real confidence isn't available. "Development? I thought we were here to discuss the management transition, the corporate partnership opportunity that—" "The store has been sold," Margaret interrupted, but her interruption was gentle, almost apologetic, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis to a patient who'd come in expecting a clean bill of health. "This morning, actually, the transaction completed at 9:47 a.m., and the new owner took possession immediately." Rachel felt something cold crawl up her spine, but she pushed it down with the same determination she used to push down doubts and questions and anything else that threatened the narrative she'd constructed about her life and her choices. "Sold? But Henderson's corporate office has been in negotiations for months about restructuring management here, about finding the right partnership to—" "The corporate office sold the entire store," Margaret continued, but now her voice carried something that might have been respect or might have been fear, or might have been the particular combination of both that powerful people inspire in those who understand exactly how much power they're witnessing. Building, inventory, contracts, everything to a private equity firm. But the new owner was very specific about timing, very insistent that the sale close before 2 p.m. today. Blake's face had gone pale, but he grabbed for Rachel's hand in a gesture that looked like support but felt like drowning men grabbing for driftwood. Who bought it? We have relationships with most of the major retail investment firms, so perhaps we can—" The door to the store's back office opened, but the person who emerged wasn't Margaret's assistant or Henderson's regional manager, or any of the people Blake had been expecting to negotiate with. Daniel Hayes walked out wearing a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Blake's car, his hair freshly cut by a barber who only took appointments from clients whose net worth had at least 9 zeros, his shoes Italian leather that had never touched a mop bucket, but had walked the corridors of power in ways that Blake could only fantasize about. Rachel's world tilted, but the tilt was just the beginning. just the first crack in a foundation that had never been as solid as she'd believed. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, because sound requires breath, and breath requires understanding, and understanding was currently impossible, because nothing made sense, nothing connected, nothing explained why her janitor ex-husband was standing in Henderson Luxury Boutique, looking like he'd stepped out of Forbes magazine. "Hello, Rachel," Daniel said, but his voice had changed, had lost the soft quality of a man trying not to take up too much space, and gained the steel of someone who'd spent 3 years wearing a disguise that he was finally removing. "Blake, thank you both for coming, but I suppose I should introduce myself properly. I'm Daniel Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global Holdings, and as of this morning, the owner of this store." The words hit Rachel like physical blows, but each one carried information that her brain couldn't process, couldn't organize into any framework that made the world make sense again. Janitor, trillionaire, owner, mall. The concept spun in her head like clothes in a dryer, tumbling and mixing but never quite coming clean. Blake found his voice first, but what came out was denial dressed up as accusation. "This is some kind of joke. You're a janitor. I've seen you mopping floors. I've seen you empty trash cans, and you can't just what?" Daniel's smile was cold, colder than anything Rachel had ever seen on his face during their marriage. Cold like mathematics, like compound interest, like consequences finally coming due. "Can't just own the mall where I mop floors. Can't just purchase stores inside my own property. Can't just spend 3 years working in the business I built while my wife climbed a ladder that I constructed." Rachel's legs felt weak, but she locked her knees because falling would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, would mean acknowledging that everything she thought she knew was wrong, that every assumption she'd built her life on was fantasy. You can't, the mall isn't Grandview Mall," Daniel continued, but now he pulled out his phone, a phone that Rachel suddenly recognized wasn't the cheap Android he'd carried during their marriage, but the latest iPhone Pro Max, and he pulled up documents that showed corporate structures and holding companies and subsidiary chains that all led back to one name, Hayes Global Holdings. Purchased 7 years ago through a Luxembourg-based subsidiary, managed through a real estate investment trust that I control, but physically present in every day because I learned early that you can't understand business unless you understand every level of it, from the executive suite to the service elevator. Margaret Chen had stepped back, but her eyes were wide with the realization that she'd been working for this man all along, that every interaction with corporate had ultimately been an interaction with the janitor she'd nodded to politely but never really seen. The other Henderson's employees had emerged from the stockroom, drawn by voices that carried the particular frequency of worlds collapsing, and they watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a social execution that was somehow both public and intimate. Blake tried one more time, but his attempt at recovery was like watching someone try to stop a tsunami with a coffee cup. "Even if this is true, and I'm not saying I believe it, you can't just interfere with legitimate business relationships, with opportunities that Rachel and I have been developing for..." "Opportunities?" Daniel's laugh was sharp, but sharp the way surgical instruments are, sharp, precise, and designed to cut through exactly what needed to be cut. "You mean the opportunities you were developing to take control of a store you don't own, in a mall you don't own, through corporate relationships that don't exist. Because I own Henderson's corporate office too, purchased it 7 years ago when I was building my retail portfolio." The silence that followed was absolute, but absolute the way black holes are absolute, pulling in everything and letting nothing escape. Rachel felt tears starting, but they weren't tears of sadness yet. They were tears of shock, of systems overloading, of a mind trying to reconcile irreconcilable information. "Why?" The word escaped Rachel's lips, but it carried 3 years of questions, 3 years of confusion that was only now starting to resolve into something that looked like clarity, but felt like drowning. Why would you do this? Why would you pretend to be something you're not? Why would you let me think you were just a janitor? Daniel finished, but his voice had softened slightly, had found some echo of the man Rachel had married before she'd decided he wasn't enough. Because my mother asked me to find someone who loved me for who I was, not what I had, but I made a mistake. I thought hiding what I had would reveal who I was, but it turns out that who we are includes how we treat people we think have nothing to offer us. The words landed like bombs, but bombs that exploded slowly, showing Rachel scenes from their marriage that she'd forgotten or ignored or rewritten in her mind. Daniel suggesting business strategies that she'd claimed as her own. Daniel reading books about retail management that she'd mocked as above his station. Daniel speaking Mandarin to the Chinese cleaning crew, French to the cafe workers, Spanish to the landscapers, but languages she'd never questioned, because people without power aren't supposed to have languages, aren't supposed to have depth, aren't supposed to be anything except what their uniforms suggest. I gave you every chance, Daniel continued, but now his voice carried something that might have been grief or might have been the particular sadness of teachers watching students fail tests they could have passed if they'd only tried. Every time I tried to discuss business with you, every time I offered ideas, every time I showed you who I was beneath the coveralls, but you couldn't see it because you'd already decided what a janitor could be, what a janitor could know, what a janitor was worth. Blake had been silent, but his silence was the silence of a man realizing he'd built his entire future on sand that was currently washing away. The Henderson deal, the corporate connections I told you about, were never real, Daniel confirmed, but there was no pleasure in his voice, just fact, just the mathematics of reality correcting the algebra of Blake's ambitions. The people you thought you were networking with were middle managers who don't make decisions, who don't control leases, who report to executives, who report to boards, who report to holding companies that I own. Rachel's phone buzzed, but the notification was from her assistant at the mall, the message short and devastating. Emergency board meeting called for 4 p.m., something about ownership changes and management restructuring. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they made was a nightmare painted in corporate letterhead and legal documents. You're going to fire me, Rachel said, but the words weren't a question. They were acceptance. They were the first step toward understanding that consequences had arrived, and they weren't interested in negotiations. Daniel shook his head, but the gesture was complicated, layered with meanings that Rachel was only beginning to understand. I'm not going to fire you, but I am going to show you exactly what you've lost, exactly what you walked away from, exactly what you valued so little that you traded it for a district manager who's about to be unemployed himself. Blake's head snapped up, but his protest died in his throat because Daniel's expression made it clear that protests were irrelevant, that the decisions had been made, and the wheels were already turning. The district manager position, Daniel explained, but his tone was professorial now, educational, like he was teaching a class on consequences that Rachel and Blake had failed to attend until the final exam. Reports to a regional manager who reports to a vice president who reports to a holding company that I acquired this morning at 10:15 a.m., approximately 90 minutes after I bought Henderson's. The scope of it was too massive, but massive the way icebergs are massive, with most of the destruction hidden beneath surface details that Rachel was only starting to comprehend. Daniel hadn't just bought a store, hadn't just revealed himself, hadn't just embarrassed them. He'd systematically dismantled every piece of the future they'd planned, every step of the ladder they'd thought they were climbing, every dream they'd convinced themselves was within reach. The board meeting at 4 p.m., Daniel continued, But now he was looking at Rachel with something that might have been pity or might have been the particular sadness of seeing someone realize they've destroyed something precious and irreplaceable, is to introduce the new ownership structure of Grandview Mall and to announce some management changes. But you'll still be general manager, Rachel. I want you to be general manager. Hope flickered in Rachel's eyes, but hope, without understanding, is just another form of denial. You want me to stay? I want you to understand, Daniel corrected, but his correction was gentle, almost kind, like a surgeon explaining why the amputation is necessary to save the life. I want you to come to work every day in a mall that you now know I own, managing stores that you now know I control, implementing strategies that you now know I could have funded all along if you'd only asked, if you'd only seen me as a partner instead of a burden. The cruelty of it was exquisite, but exquisite the way a perfectly constructed argument is exquisite, airtight and irrefutable and devastating in its completeness. Rachel would keep her job, would keep her office, would keep her title, but every single day she'd walk past stores owned by her ex-husband, would implement policies approved by her ex-husband, would attend meetings chaired by her ex-husband, and she'd remember that she'd had the chance to build an empire with him and had chosen instead to settle for a fantasy with a man who'd never had any power at all. As for you, Daniel turned to Blake, but his expression had lost even the cold professionalism he'd shown Rachel, had become something harder, something that suggested Blake's consequences would be different and more severe. Your employment ends today, but not because I'm firing you, because the company you work for is being restructured, and district managers who spend their time plotting to take over stores they don't own through connections they don't have aren't really assets worth retaining. Blake opened his mouth, but what came out was desperation dressed up as defiance. You can't do this. I have contracts. I have rights. I have an attorney who's going to tell you that employment at will means exactly what it sounds like. Daniel interrupted, but his interruption was final, absolute, the period at the end of a sentence that Blake had written himself, through choices he'd thought were clever, but were actually just transparent. Margaret has your termination paperwork ready, but you should know that I've also contacted the other mall management companies in the region, the ones I don't own, and made them aware of your tendency to misrepresent corporate relationships, and I imagine they'll be very interested in reviewing their management teams for similar issues. The destruction was total, but total the way controlled demolitions are total, precise and planned, and impossible to stop once the charges are set. Blake's career wasn't just ending, it was being erased, wiped from the landscape of possibilities that he'd mapped out in conversations with Rachel, in plans they'd made over champagne and ambition and the particular arrogance of people who think their targets are too weak to fight back. I should beg, Rachel said suddenly, but the words surprised even her, came from some part of her brain that was processing faster than her pride could prevent. I should get on my knees right now and beg for mercy, beg you to forgive me, beg you to give me another chance. Daniel studied her, but his study was clinical, detached, like a scientist examining a specimen that had once been precious, but had become just another data point in a larger experiment. Would you mean it? He asked. But the question was genuine, curious, like he really wanted to know if Rachel had learned anything, or if she was just performing contrition, the way she'd performed affection during a marriage that had been real for him, but transactional for her. Rachel started to answer, but the truth stuck in her throat, because the truth was complicated, was layered with realizations that were still forming, still crystallizing into something she could name. She'd loved Daniel once, or thought she had, but had it been love or had it been the comfort of having someone who asked for so little, who demanded so little, who seemed content to be invisible while she shined? And if she begged now, would it be for Daniel or for the trillionaire he'd turned out to be, For the man she'd divorced or for the empire he commanded? I don't know, Rachel admitted, but admission is the first step toward honesty, even if honesty comes too late to save anything worth saving. I don't know if I'd mean it. Don't know if I'm sorry for hurting you or sorry for losing what you could have given me. Don't know if I ever really saw you at all. Daniel nodded, but the gesture carried approval, like a teacher acknowledging a student who's finally given the right answer, even if the answer came too late to pass the course. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 2 years, he observed, but observation without emotion, without heat, without anything except the cool assessment of someone who's moved on from anger to indifference. And it's enough for me to tell you this: you'll keep your job because you're good at it, because your management has been effective and the mall has prospered under your leadership. But you'll keep it knowing that every success you have is built on an infrastructure I created, knowing that every achievement you celebrate is happening in a space I own, knowing that the ladder you're climbing leads to ceilings I constructed. The mercy was worse than revenge, but worse the way being forced to live with your mistakes is worse than being punished for them. Worse the way understanding your own smallness is worse than being told you're small. Rachel would go on, would manage, would succeed even, but she'd do it all in the shadow of what she'd lost, in the echo of what she'd failed to see, in the permanent reminder that she'd been married to someone extraordinary and had convinced herself he was ordinary because extraordinary didn't match the costume he was wearing. And Blake, Daniel added, but now his voice had gone cold again, had lost the thread of almost kindness he'd shown Rachel, and returned to pure business, pure consequence, pure mathematics. You'll leave now, but you'll leave knowing that every opportunity you cost Rachel was built on lies you told about relationships you didn't have. Every plan you made was constructed on foundations that didn't exist. Every promise you made to her was a promise you couldn't keep because you never had the power you claimed. Blake left without another word, but his departure was the departure of a man who'd been exposed not just as powerless but as a fraud, someone who'd built his entire value proposition on smoke and mirrors and contacts that turned out to be just middle managers without influence. The door closed behind him with the finality of books closing, of chapters ending, of futures canceled before they could begin. Margaret Chen cleared her throat, but her interruption was professional, necessary, the sound of someone reminding principals that there are still practicalities to attend to even after worlds have ended. Mr. Hayes, the Henderson corporate team is on video conference waiting to discuss the transition procedures, and the new inventory management systems you requested are ready for your review. Daniel nodded, but before he turned to follow Margaret to the back office, he looked at Rachel one more time, really looked at her in a way he hadn't during the last year of their marriage, looked at her with eyes that saw everything she was and everything she'd chosen not to be. I loved you, he said simply, but simplicity in this context carried weight, carried years, carried the particular grief of loving someone who couldn't love you back, because they couldn't see you clearly enough to love. I loved you enough to spend 3 years hoping you'd see past the janitor to the person, hoping you'd ask why a janitor spoke Mandarin or read The Economist, or had opinions on commercial real estate trends. But you never asked because you'd already decided what I was worth. Rachel felt tears streaming now, but these tears were different, were the tears of understanding rather than shock, were the tears of someone finally seeing clearly and hating what clarity revealed. I'm sorry, she whispered, but whispers in this moment were insufficient, were too small for the size of what she'd lost, too quiet for the magnitude of her mistake. I know, Daniel replied, but his response was acceptance not of apology but of reality, acknowledgement that sorry doesn't rebuild what's been demolished, doesn't resurrect what's been buried, doesn't change the fact that some choices are permanent and some consequences are forever. But sorry doesn't change the fact that you looked at a man mopping floors and decided that's all he'd ever be. Doesn't change the fact that you chose a district manager's promises over your husband's presence. Doesn't change the fact that you valued appearance over substance so completely that you missed the substance entirely. He walked away then, but his walking away was different than Blake's departure, was the walking away of someone who'd said everything that needed saying and had nothing left to prove. The door to the back office closed, and Rachel stood in the middle of Henderson Luxury Boutique, surrounded by things she couldn't afford, in a store she couldn't control, in a mall she didn't own, engaged to a man who'd just been fired, divorced from a man who just revealed himself to be everything she'd ever wanted but hadn't recognized when it was wearing coveralls instead of Tom Ford. The other Henderson's employees had slowly returned to work, but their glances toward Rachel carried the particular mixture of pity and judgment that retail workers reserve for customers who've made scenes, who've revealed themselves in ways they'll regret later when the embarrassment sets in. Rachel knew she should leave, should walk out with whatever dignity she could salvage, but her legs wouldn't move, wouldn't carry her away from the epicenter of her destruction. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a calendar notification. Board meeting, 4 p.m., conference room A, RE ownership transition and management review. She had 90 minutes to prepare for a meeting where her ex-husband would be introduced as her boss's boss's boss, where the entire corporate structure she'd been navigating for 18 months would be revealed as a fiction, where every assumption she'd made about power and hierarchy and success would be corrected with the brutal efficiency of accountants closing books at the end of a quarter that had gone badly wrong. Rachel finally walked out of Henderson's, but her walk was mechanical, automatic, the movement of someone in shock who's going through motions, because motion is easier than standing still and thinking about what standing still means. The mall around her looked different now, but different the way things look different when you learn they belong to someone else, when spaces you thought were neutral territory turn out to be someone's property, someone's kingdom, someone's empire that you've been walking through without understanding that every step was permitted rather than free. The fountain in the center court still flowed, but its water caught light differently now, sparkled with the particular mockery of things that are beautiful but indifferent to human drama. Rachel saw Daniel's mop bucket near the service corridor, abandoned now because the man who'd pushed it didn't need to push it anymore, didn't need to hide anymore, didn't need to test anymore because the test was over and Rachel had failed so completely that even the grading seemed redundant. She made it to her office, but her office was smaller now, was less impressive now, was revealed as a middle manager's space rather than a seat of power. The photos on her desk showed Rachel at charity events, Rachel cutting ribbons at store openings, Rachel shaking hands with vendors and designers and corporate representatives who she now realized might have known all along, might have been part of Daniel's test, might have been watching her fail in real time and reporting back to the janitor who wasn't a janitor at all. At 3:47 p.m., Rachel's assistant knocked with the particular timidity of someone who'd heard rumors and didn't know how to navigate the social minefield that office gossip had become. "Ms. Morrison, the board members are gathering early, and there's someone here who says he's the new owner? A Mr. Hayes? But he looks like, I thought he was." "He was," Rachel confirmed, but confirmation without explanation, because explanation would require energy she didn't have, words she couldn't organize, admissions she wasn't ready to make. "Is." The confusion on her assistant's face would have been funny in another context, would have been the kind of misunderstanding that makes for good stories at parties. But there was nothing funny about this context, nothing amusing about the revelation that was about to ripple through the entire mall staff, like an earthquake revealing fault lines no one knew existed. Rachel walked to the conference room, but each step felt like climbing gallows, like approaching judgment, like moving toward a future she could see but couldn't avoid. The board members were already there. 5 people she'd presented reports to, had impressed with metrics and strategies, had cultivated relationships with over 18 months of careful management. They looked at her differently now, but different the way people look at someone who's been involved in a scandal, with curiosity and distance and the particular caution of people who aren't sure if association is safe anymore. Daniel entered at exactly 4 p.m., but his entrance was different than any entrance Rachel had seen from him before, was the entrance of someone who owned the room in ways both literal and metaphorical. He'd changed clothes again, now wearing business casual that probably cost what Rachel made in a week, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of people who've built empires and don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. "Good afternoon," Daniel began, but his greeting was professional, appropriate, the voice of someone chairing a board meeting rather than destroying an ex-wife's understanding of reality. "I'm Daniel Hayes, CEO of Hayes Global Holdings, and as of this morning, the primary stakeholder in Grandview Mall, through a series of acquisitions that I'll be outlining in today's presentation." The board members looked confused, but their confusion was starting to organize into understanding, into the recognition that the man they'd seen mopping floors in the background of their site visits was actually the man who'd been funding their paychecks, who'd been reviewing their reports, who'd been present all along but invisible in the way that people in service positions are invisible to those who don't value service. Daniel's presentation was thorough, but thorough the way autopsies are thorough, revealing every layer of structure and ownership and control that had existed beneath the surface of what everyone had assumed was a standard mall management arrangement. Hayes Global Holdings owned the property. A subsidiary owned Henderson's. Another subsidiary owned the company that employed Blake Patterson. Another subsidiary owned the cleaning service that employed the janitor version of Daniel. The connections were intricate, complex, but ultimately clear. Daniel Hayes controlled everything, had always controlled everything, had been running an experiment in human nature that had just concluded with results that no one was happy about. "Ms. Morrison will continue as general manager," Daniel announced, but his announcement carried the weight of decision rather than discussion, of authority that didn't require consensus or approval. Her performance metrics have been excellent, her management has been effective, and despite recent personal complications, her professional capabilities remain valuable to the continued success of this property. Rachel felt eyes turning toward her, but the eyes carried questions she couldn't answer, carried curiosity about personal complications that would become gossip by tomorrow, would become legend by next week, would become the cautionary tale that mall employees told each other about the dangers of not seeing people clearly. The meeting continued for 90 minutes, but the 90 minutes felt like hours, felt like being slowly dissected in front of an audience, felt like dying incrementally while staying alive enough to witness your own autopsy. Daniel outlined new policies, new strategic directions, new management structures that would report through layers of corporate oversight that all ultimately led back to him. He was professional throughout, was appropriate throughout, was never cruel or vindictive or anything except businesslike. But his professionalism was its own cruelty because it showed Rachel exactly what she'd lost. Not just a trillionaire, but a professional trillionaire. Not just someone with money, but someone with competence and vision and the ability to build things that lasted. When the meeting finally ended, the board members filed out with the particular hurry of people escaping uncomfortable situations. But they left Rachel behind because Rachel couldn't escape, couldn't file out, couldn't return to a world where any of this made sense. Daniel gathered his materials, but his gathering was methodical, patient, like someone who had all the time in the world, because when you own the world, time becomes just another resource you control. "Daniel," Rachel started, but her voice broke on his name, broke on the weight of everything that name now carried. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Daniel looked up, but his expression was neutral, was waiting, was the face of someone who'd learned long ago that questions usually reveal more about the asker than the answers reveal about the asked. "Did you ever really love me?" Rachel continued, but the question came out broken, came out desperate, came out like the last hope of someone drowning and reaching for anything that might float. Or was this whole thing, the marriage, the job, the test, was it all just some billionaire's experiment in how regular people fail moral examinations? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, but quiet the way deep water is quiet, with currents moving beneath surface calm that suggest complexity beyond what's visible. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, were chosen, were the words of someone who'd thought about this question during 3 years of pushing mop buckets and watching his wife fall in love with someone else. "I loved you," he said finally, but his past tense was sharp, was definitive, was the past tense of something that had died and been buried and wouldn't be resurrected no matter how many tears Rachel cried over its grave. "I loved you enough to give you a chance to love me back without the complication of wealth, without the question of whether you loved me or loved what I could provide. But the test wasn't about you passing or failing. The test was about me learning whether love could survive invisibility, whether partnership could exist without power imbalance, whether two people could build something real before money made everything unreal." "And?" Rachel asked, but she already knew the answer, could taste it in the air between them, could feel it in the distance that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with emotional continents that had drifted apart and couldn't be brought back together. "And I learned that you couldn't love someone you didn't respect," Daniel replied. But his reply was gentle despite its devastation, was kind despite its cruelty, was the answer of someone who'd grieved the loss long before the divorce papers made it official. "I learned that respect requires seeing people as complete rather than as functions, that you loved the idea of a husband who could elevate you, but couldn't love an actual husband who mopped floors, even when that husband tried to show you in 1,000 small ways that mopping floors was a choice rather than a limitation." Rachel felt something break inside her, but breaking in this context was actually mending, was the painful process of bones being reset after healing wrong, was the necessary destruction that precedes proper reconstruction. "I'm sorry," she said again, but this time the apology carried weight, carried understanding, carried the beginning of genuine regret rather than the regret of someone sorry they got caught or sorry they lost something valuable. "I know," Daniel repeated, but this time his repetition carried something that might have been forgiveness or might have been the indifference that comes after forgiveness becomes irrelevant. "And that's why you're keeping your job, why I'm not destroying your career the way I could, why I'm giving you the chance to learn something from this, even if the learning comes too late to save what we had." He moved toward the door, but Rachel stopped him with a question that surprised both of them. "What about Blake? Why destroy him when you're showing me mercy?" Daniel paused, but his pause was thoughtful, was the pause of someone considering how much truth to tell and deciding that this moment deserved complete honesty. "Because you made a mistake," he explained. But his explanation was the explanation of someone drawing careful distinctions, someone who understood that morality isn't binary but exists in shades that require nuance to navigate. You misunderstood value, misidentified worth, made bad choices based on false assumptions, but Blake didn't make mistakes. Blake built his entire career on exploitation, on manipulating people like you into trusting him, on pretending to have power and relationships he never possessed, on being a predator who targeted ambition and turned it into vulnerability he could exploit. The distinction was clear, but clarity in this moment was brutal, was the difference between someone who'd been foolish and someone who'd been deliberately cruel, between someone who'd failed a test they didn't know they were taking, and someone who'd cheated on a test they knew existed. "Will I ever see you again?" Rachel asked. But the question was small. Was the question of someone who'd lost the right to ask but was asking anyway. Was the question of someone hoping for a future that would never arrive. "You'll see me every day," Daniel reminded her, but his reminder was factual, was the statement of someone pointing out obvious truth. In board meetings and property reviews and strategic planning sessions. But if you're asking whether you'll see me the way you saw me during our marriage, the answer is no. You'll see the CEO now, the owner, the person who was always there but you couldn't recognize because recognition requires attention and attention requires respect. He left then, really left, and Rachel was alone in the conference room that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too full of silence that used to be filled with a husband who'd loved her and a future that could have been extraordinary if she'd only had the wisdom to recognize extraordinary when it was wearing coveralls. Rachel sat there for hours, but the hours passed like minutes because time becomes strange when you're reconstructing your entire understanding of your life, when you're replaying 3 years of marriage through a new lens that shows you every moment you dismissed Daniel, every time you interrupted him, every instance where you treated his ideas as cute rather than valuable, every second where you looked at the janitor instead of seeing the man. She remembered the time Daniel had suggested a different traffic flow pattern for the food court, and she'd patted his hand and said, "That's sweet that you're thinking about these things, but mall management is more complex than you realize." The next week, she'd presented the same idea to the board and taken credit for the 23% increase in food court revenue that followed. She remembered the time Daniel had mentioned that Henderson's could benefit from better integration with the mall's loyalty program, and she'd laughed and said janitors didn't understand luxury retail. 6 months later, Blake had suggested the same integration, and she'd called him brilliant and agreed to dinner to discuss it further. She remembered 1,000 small cruelties, 1,000 dismissals, 1,000 moments where she'd treated Daniel like he was less than, like he was other than, like he was something to be tolerated rather than someone to be treasured. And each memory was a knife that cut differently now that she understood what she'd been cutting, what she'd been destroying, what she'd been losing without even knowing it was possible to lose something so valuable. The worst memory came last, came with the particular vividness of moments that define who we are and reveal what we value. 3 months before the divorce, Daniel had come home early from his night shift and found Rachel on the phone with Blake, laughing in a way she never laughed with Daniel anymore, her voice bright and engaged in ways that used to be reserved for the man she'd married. Daniel had stood in the doorway of their apartment, the apartment he owned through a real estate subsidiary but paid rent on to maintain his disguise, and Rachel had looked at him with irritation, had waved him away like he was interrupting something important. "It's just the janitor I married," she'd said to Blake, not bothering to cover the phone, not caring that Daniel could hear every word. He doesn't understand that some conversations are private, that some relationships exist on a different level than sweeping floors and taking out trash. Daniel had gone to bed alone that night, but he'd gone to bed having made a decision, having reached a conclusion that 3 years of testing had been enough, that the experiment was over, that the results were in, and they showed exactly what he'd feared they'd show, that Rachel loved success more than she loved him, that she valued appearance more than substance, that she would always choose the district manager over the janitor because she could never see past the uniform to the person beneath. Rachel cried in the empty conference room, but her crying was different now. Was the crying of someone who understood rather than someone who was shocked? Was the crying of someone mourning not just what she'd lost, but who she'd been when she'd lost it, who she'd revealed herself to be through choices that seemed reasonable at the time but looked monstrous in retrospect? Her phone buzzed with messages from friends who'd heard rumors, from former colleagues asking if the stories were true, from her mother asking if she was okay, but Rachel couldn't answer any of them because answering would require explaining, and explaining would require admitting, and admitting would require facing the fact that she'd destroyed her own life through a series of choices that had seemed smart, but were actually just small, just petty, just the choices of someone who'd mistaken climbing for flying and had been so focused on the next rung that she never noticed the ladder was leading nowhere. At 8:47 p.m., Rachel finally left the mall, but leaving felt like escape, like fleeing a crime scene, like running from evidence that would follow her everywhere, because the evidence was her, was in her, was the permanent record of choices she could never unchoose. The parking lot was nearly empty, but Daniel's car, a Bentley Continental GT that probably cost more than Rachel would make in 5 years, was still there, still waiting, still present in the way Daniel had always been present, but Rachel had never noticed. She sat in her car, a leased Toyota that she'd been proud of until today, that had represented success until she'd learned what actual success looked like, and she understood with brutal clarity that this was her life now. Managing a mall she didn't own for an ex-husband she'd divorced because she thought she could do better, working in a building where every decision ultimately required approval from the man she'd decided wasn't worth her time, living with the permanent reminder that she'd been offered everything and had chosen nothing because she couldn't recognize everything when it wasn't gift-wrapped in corner offices and corporate titles. The mercy Daniel had shown her wasn't mercy at all, but it was the mercy she deserved, the mercy of being allowed to live with her choices, of being forced to understand consequences, not through punishment but through presence, of having to face every single day the magnitude of what she'd lost and why she'd lost it. Rachel drove home to an apartment she'd taken in the divorce, an apartment that seemed spacious and modern until she remembered that Daniel had probably owned the building, probably owned the entire development, probably owned half the city while mopping floors and coveralls that cost less than the toilet paper in the executive bathrooms. She poured wine she couldn't afford and looked out windows that showed a city that was different now, that was revealed as Daniel's city, Daniel's property, Daniel's kingdom that he'd built, while she'd been busy not noticing him. Her phone showed a notification from the mall's internal system, new corporate policies uploaded for review, new strategic initiatives requiring management approval, new ownership structure documentation that Rachel was required to read and sign and acknowledge. She opened the files, but each page was a reminder. Each policy was evidence. Each organizational chart was proof that she'd been married to the man at the top and had traded him for a man who'd been fired from the bottom. The worst document came last, came with the particular cruelty of thoroughness. A complete corporate history of Hayes Global Holdings, showing Daniel's acquisition timeline, his business development, his strategic vision that had transformed an inheritance into an empire. There were photos of Daniel in boardrooms, Daniel shaking hands with senators and tech CEOs and international business leaders, Daniel speaking at conferences and accepting awards and being everything Rachel had said she wanted, while she'd been sleeping next to him and seeing only a janitor who wasn't ambitious enough. And in the final pages, there was a personal note, brief and devastating. To Rachel, "You asked if I ever really loved you. This documentation shows what I built while loving you, what I created while hoping you'd see me, what I accomplished while wearing coveralls and mopping floors, and waiting for you to ask a single question about who I was beneath what I appeared to be. You never asked. That's your answer. DH." Rachel read the note 17 times, but each reading revealed new layers of loss, new dimensions of mistake, new depths of regret that would follow her through every day of a career that would be successful and hollow and haunted by the ghost of what could have been if she'd only had the wisdom to see, the courage to ask, the humility to recognize that value isn't always visible and worth isn't always obvious, and love requires seeing people as they are rather than as their costumes suggest they should be. She went to bed alone, but alone was her future now, was her choice, was the consequence of decisions she'd made when she thought she was choosing up but was actually choosing down, when she thought she was being ambitious but was actually being blind, when she thought she was securing her future but was actually destroying it with the particular thoroughness of people who mistake activity for progress and climbing for growth. The last thought Rachel had before sleep finally came was simple but devastating. Daniel had loved her enough to give her every chance, had tested her to see if she could love him without wealth complicating the equation, had waited 3 years for her to ask a single question that would have revealed everything. But she'd never asked because she'd already decided she knew the answer, had already concluded that janitors were janitors and district managers were tickets to better futures, had already determined that appearance mattered more than substance and uniforms revealed truth rather than hiding it. And now she knew better, but knowledge that comes after chances are exhausted is just another name for regret, just another way of saying that wisdom arrived too late, that understanding developed after the test was over and the results were final, and the future was fixed in a shape that would never include the trillionaire janitor who'd loved her enough to hope she'd love him back, and had learned instead that some people can only see value when it's performing visibility, can only recognize worth when it's wearing the right costume, can only love what they can brag about rather than who they can build with. The mercy was that she'd keep her job. The punishment was that she'd keep her job. And the lesson, the permanent, irrevocable, too late to matter lesson, was that she'd had everything and had seen nothing, had held treasure and had called it trash, had been married to extraordinary and had divorced it to marry ordinary, and now she'd spend the rest of her career working in the shadow of what she'd lost, reminded every single day that the greatest wealth she'd ever possessed wasn't the trillionaire's empire she could have shared, but the trillionaire's love she'd destroyed, because she was too busy looking up to notice what was right in front of her, too focused on climbing to recognize she'd already arrived, too convinced of her own vision to see that she was blind in the ways that mattered most.